Okay, hi everybody. Today is Tuesday, December 19th. Welcome to this week's SIG Testing weekly meeting. I am Aaron Krickenberger. This meeting is being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube shortly. On today's agenda, I put down a bunch of things that are just sort of at the top of my mind lately. 1.9 successfully went out the door. Hooray. I haven't heard of any show-stopping bugs. Even better. That's pretty good for a Dotto. And so there are a couple things I've been trying to push through in the background. If anybody's interested here, I can try running through the SIG testing slides that I went through at KubeCon real quickly. I don't think there's too much, but I can breeze through them in like 5 minutes. Does anybody want to see them? Or, okay, I'm seeing thumbs up and nodding of heads. Okay, let me go find those and do the screen sharing thing with the stuff. Okay, minimize that. Okay, so SIG testing update, I gave this back in December 5th. I saved this quote from Clayton, which I thought just perfectly captured what we're about here at SIG testing. I sort of assumed that people at KubeCon had heard me ramble about some of the stuff that we do at community meetings, and maybe they've heard of some of these tools, maybe they haven't. I'd like to do sort of a deeper walkthrough that kind of combines how all of these things link together, but that's not really what this talk was about. The idea was, roughly speaking, we have a lot of tools that help people deal with tests and the running and execution of them and what you do with those test results. And I tried to break it down into 3 arbitrary categories of automation, visualization, and other. Conversely, we think that all of the other SIGs out there are responsible kind of for their tests and the ways that they run them and the ways that they display or group those results. There are tests at a variety of levels. I only called out the 3 common ones. There are probably others. There are 3 kinds of jobs that we're aware of. Pre-submits are the one we most actively care about, but post-submits actually make up the largest volume of our stuff. And then there's periodic, and we don't actually have a good naming pattern to differentiate post-submits from periodics. Fun numbers that I found by scraping through are the same BigQuery table that stores all the results that Kubernetes and a couple other things look at. Some of the numbers I found interesting were that over the past year, we've run about 3.5 million jobs, and that's just post-submit jobs. We've also run about 650,000, 660,000 pull request jobs. So ballpark, that's 4 million for the year, which is a lot. Another statistic I found interesting was that our pull request jobs are more likely to pass than our post-submit jobs. That's a good statistic, but 80% is still kind of a lower pass rate than I'd like. On the other hand, pull request jobs are by definition going to be people submitting occasionally broken code, so we can't always expect those to pass at 100%. And the other statistic I found really interesting was that over the year, Kubernetes merged about 9,500 PRs, and Test Infra merged about 3,300. So it's a significantly smaller repo, but it's significantly higher velocity, which I thought was kind of cool. Go team, yay us. The other neat thing was that the number of distinct jobs sort of has doubled across the year. We did have this, it was kind of difficult to get the accounting right for the distinct jobs that we had in November of 2016 because we were migrating from one naming scheme to another. But ballpark, we were around 380 back then. Some graphs where I try to convince you that it might be worth ignoring slow jobs. So here's where I tried to break up into the blue lines and bars represent jobs that take less than an hour, and the purple ones are jobs that take more than an hour. This is for pre-submit jobs. The bars are the quantity run per month, and the dashed lines represent the pass rate. And just splitting things out by an hour, it's more likely that a pre-submit job is going to pass. Just by looking at the quantity of time it takes to run alone, this is pretty intuitive, right? If the job runs for longer, it's more likely to fail. And I'm not sure what we did over October and November to greatly improve the pass-fail rate for jobs that take longer than an hour, but it still kind of seems like if a job takes longer than an hour, we probably shouldn't even bother running it or paying any attention to it. It's if you break it down to look at test results instead of job results, there's this fun statistic where like we're passing the majority of our test cases. It's just that because one random test flight can take out an entire job, these numbers are significantly higher than these numbers, but these numbers are the ones we actually gate all of our pull requests on. It's a similar story for post-submit jobs, only here I broke things up by 2 hours instead of 1 hour because post-submits are by their very nature intended to run longer, more resource and intensive jobs. And the pass rate's pretty abysmal for anything that takes over 2 hours. Again, maybe a case is to be made here that we shouldn't even bother running jobs that take longer than 2 hours because nobody has really been doing much to improve the state of their pass rate. And it's a similar story for the test cases, right? I'm not entirely sure what that dip was about in August, but roughly speaking, we're passing a lot of test cases. It's just the jobs themselves, which are the signal we look at for blocking releases and other things. One thing I thought was really cool was the time since last merge graph. We saw some excitement with that more recently with coming out of code freeze. So unfortunately, I don't have that graph. It was maybe more insightful. But I tried to explain to you folks how we sort of use the yellow line to show the queue depth, and we use the green jagged sawtooth lines to show the time since last merge. And if the yellow line is increasing and the time since last merge is also increasing past a certain threshold, we alert on that. There's also this sort of big hump in the right there where I believe you can see that the little sawtooths down below show that merging is happening as usual, but the quantity of pull requests being merged is not going down fast enough. And this, I believe, is where we collectively learned that if we can't do batch merges, we start to fall behind our merge capacity pretty badly. This graph doesn't directly illustrate that. It'd be nice to find a graph that does, but again, I know a lot of our recent fun with the submit queue after code freeze probably hammered home that same point where if the queue gets reordered a lot and invalidates our batch merges, that's a bad thing. Okay, this was fun. I showed this and said, look at how many jobs we have that have been failing for over 90 consecutive days in red, let alone the jobs that have been failing for more than 60 consecutive days in orange. What do these jobs look like? This is the worst one. This is the serial job, QA serial job for Google GCI, and you can see how it's pretty flaky and it's kind of difficult to tell what the appropriate thing to fix is here. This is sorted by quantity of failures, so within the past however many days this is, maybe SIG Node should be looking at this particular issue, but at least at this time they hadn't yet. This was another one of my favorite dashboards. This is Google proving to us that GKE works. Here's another one where Google proves that GKE works. I mean, this is basically like Conway's game of life. It's almost impossible to derive any meaningful signal from this. I'm not sure why we bother to even generate this data if we're not doing anything to improve it. Here's an example of a release blocking job. This was one of the upgrade jobs where the cluster was actually upgrading, but none of the disruptive network partition tests owned by SIG apps were passing in any meaningful way. And here's an example of KubeADM also failing similarly, right? These sorts of things, I'm trying to figure out how do we incentivize people to fix their tests? Is it a question of them not knowing that these tests are failing? Is it a question of the tests not being possible to debug or reproduce? Right now, I'm just sort of operating at the high level of should we maybe just declare bankruptcy on jobs that have been failing for more than 60 days? Because that would get rid of 45 of our jobs. If I'm really aggressive and say a job that's been failing for more than 3 days in a row just isn't worth running until we figure out like why it's failing, that would get rid of 70 jobs. And since I said that was about 600 jobs total that we're running right now, this would, cut our cost by about 16% or so, which might be meaningful if we're talking about paying real money to run our tests. And then the final thing is at a community meeting, this was the list of stuff that I said we'd do for 1.9, basically end of life as much as we could, start to put together a really well-defined support policy and enable better support by non-Googlers. For better or for worse, this is the state of what I think we actually did. We have migrated the majority of Jenkins jobs to Prow jobs, but not all of them. We have migrated the majority of Munge GitHub Mungers to Prow plugins, but not all of them. And we are in the process of turning the submit queue down in favor of Tide in a couple repos, but not all of them yet. Operational transparency, I showed you that wonderful time to merge graph, and we're interested in instrumenting more of our things, but I don't think we've gotten as far as turning them into graphs that are actionable. And then AWS has provided us credits for AWS testing. We've been using those actively for Canary jobs, and I believe we are in the midst of, if we have not already, converted most of the remaining COPS AWS jobs to use that account. But despite the fact that this is all that we got done, don't worry, this is SIG testing, this is fine. And that's where I just asked for any old question. Okay, I didn't see anything pop up on chat, so I'm gonna stop sharing and see what we got there. Any questions or reactions on any of that? Okay, cool. I guess that was self-explanatory. Eric, did you wanna maybe, can you correct me? Was I right on the status of where we are with AWS, just since we have Matt Landis with us today? I wanted to make sure, wanted to double check where we are on using the AWS credits.
I think we have some non-blocking jobs that are using it, but I think we're waiting for some credits or some quota to be able to run. We need to be able to run like, I think 12 clusters, 12 5-node clusters at the same time. And so last I checked, we're running through quota things with that. But then otherwise, yes, we are good to go. And then there's a bunch of other jobs which are using it.
Have you already opened up an issue to get your quota increased?
I believe so, yes. And we have a thread with Arun. And I can, if you send me your email, I can add you to that thread if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll throw it in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, otherwise, that's going great. So, and thank you for that, AWS.
Yeah, I see that as, like, Arun kind of tapped me on the shoulder pretty constantly at KubeCon about making sure we were moving forward in the right direction with that. I hear an interest in, once we've proven that we have the credits to meet our existing testing needs, the idea is we could expand the class of tests that we're running. I've heard of the potential for testing HA configurations, potentially as driven by COPS through the cluster lifecycle SIG. So I would imagine this isn't the last time we're going to be needing to change quotas and whatnot. So I want to make sure we've got the right people involved and we don't have too many hands figuring out what the other hand is doing there. But that's really good progress. Okay, so on the topic of Tide, sorry, finding the agenda. I guess I can just share this screen too, so we all know what I'm looking at when I'm talking about it. Okay, so I'm curious where we are on rolling out Tide. We had a lot of consternation over the submit queue being a little funky over the weekend. It's cleared itself out, which is great, but we had talked about, well, why don't we just turn on Tide and this will totally relieve all of our problems that we've been having with capacity. I would prefer that we try to establish a precedent of warning the community if we're going to do something that impacts the way things operate within the community. And I feel like turning on Tide immediately would probably go against those expectations and not be the best way for us to earn trust. I've sort of been left with the impression that we have canary Tide on a number of repos and are pretty happy with it. We think that the UI kind of still needs some work, but there is a UI. I saw a PR by Joe Finney to sort of set status context on PRs explaining whether they were in the pool or out of the pool. And I think that we don't really have any documentation on what Tide is from a user-facing perspective. So for people who are used to consuming the submit queue website, they're used to seeing a history of what's been merged and why. They're used to seeing information about how things are ordered. They're used to seeing a page that describes all of the labels that are necessary and criteria that are necessary for their pull request to get merged. They understand what the queue is. It's these sort of expectations I personally feel like need to be documented a little bit better for Tide to be turned on Kubernetes. Having said that, I'm currently like trying to push it for the Kubernetes community repo, which would be another high traffic repo, and in my opinion, kind of a canary for what this process would go like. So I opened up a straw man pull request. My next step would be to tell the community that I'm going to do this before I would outright enable it for the community. One of my questions is whether or not it's possible to have Tide running and have Munge GitHub running. So remove the submit queue munger out of Munge GitHub because there's still a number of other mungers that are useful to us. But let Tide take over the merging responsibilities.
That's 100% possible. There's no problems with that.
Okay. And so it could be, since the community repo doesn't really have each pull request getting exercised through many, many tests, people are less confused about what are these tests, why are they failing, and where can I go see the test results. So a UI explaining this sort of stuff might be less necessary. Plus turning it on community would help establish trust that this thing actually works and get people comfortable with it. But I still feel like it's worth notifying the Kubernetes dev mailing list and opening an issue in the Kubernetes community repo and letting people know that this is coming. What do y'all think?
We definitely need Tide documentation. I think we could, obviously we can create a README and such for that, but I think it might also be good to serve it on the Tide dashboard as well, just so that everything's all in one place.
I've been trying to make Tide more self-documenting. So like, for example, in the most recent set of changes I made to it, it links to a page that kind of even explains like what GitHub statuses are, things like that. I'm hoping we can just make things very, very obvious just glancing at the page, but I do think it would be useful to also link to a more detailed doc kind of outlining like what it is, why it's there, that sort of thing. Because I don't think that belongs like on the dashboard or anything like that.
Yeah, I agree there. I'm underwater on a couple of other obligations. I think sort of in general that we could stand to refresh the state of documentation around all of our automation from a sort of a contributor consumable perspective. And I'm wondering where the best place is for these docs to live. My gut has always told me that Kubernetes community is the place for people to learn how to interact with the automation that is driving the Kubernetes project and how that automation is deployed, as opposed to test infra docs that explain stuff that's a little more specific to our code, or like how to take our stack and deploy it for your own project. Is that the right distinction, or am I making that up?
It could be. I think another thing that's really powerful though is being able to host documents like on deck or similar like in the server, because then it's a lot easier like when you're changing the code to see that the doc is right there and to change it.
I think for most of the docs, things like the plugin help are the way to go, where it just kind of documents itself, but we probably still want a doc somewhere that says like, this is Tide, we use it for merging, that kind of thing. Because I think that's like I think most of the time when you visit Tide or whatever, at that point you're already aware of it. You don't really need to be told that Tide is doing merging and things, hopefully, but there probably should still be a place that tells you that.
We should at least link to that help documentation then from the site. I think we should definitely make it possible for people to go to the Tide site and then get help right there.
Yeah, I agree.
Hi, I'm Matt Farina. You don't see me around here very often, but I started to get a little involved in the testing stuff. And one of the things that I've been talking with folks about lately is, so say I don't know how the Tide or what Tide is or Prow or any of this, and I come in to do pull requests, I'm newer and I'm trying to get involved. I show up, how do I even know what labels mean what? And how do I even find, so you talk about a Tide site, how do I even know that exists if I enter in coming in from outside the Kubernetes or somebody who's not engulfed in it? And where does that documentation live? And something like the community repo I see linked in there, but putting documentation on pages that somebody has to know how to discover, isn't that already a difficult findability problem?
So,
We added a dashboard to the top of the site, so if you're interacting with any other PROW systems, there should be a link now at the top.
How do I know about the PROW site if I'm new?
I'm
It
wondering
should
if
be linked
the
to from
right
the
thing to do
results.
here is to point new contributors to the new contributor guide that is actively being worked on by folks at SIG Contributor Experience. I've seen them attempt to really reduce the litany and copy pasta and stale docs that we have around the pull request process in general. And I would view that as the lowest level of fidelity, where we just tell people just the commands that they need to get their pull requests through the process and what the labels mean and why. I don't necessarily think that's the place to describe the motivation and thesis behind why we're using Tide instead of Munch GitHub, or why owners files even exist when GitHub has code owners. So I think there's the how do I just, give me the TLDR version, and then I think there's the longer version of here is all of our automation and how it's hooked up and wired together and why we have the automation built this way. And then I think outside of the community repo, in the testing for repo, these are all of the projects that testinfo manages. There should be readmes in each of these directories that explain this individually deployable component and what it is and why and how to use it on your own project.
So I think as well, we should, the documentation for a developer that has a comment put on their PR that leads them to the thing, they should be able to discover all the components from there. And so today, the question of I guess like you're saying, there's a bunch of different questions that need to be answered in a different way. And also when we're rolling out new changes, I don't think any of the other documentation is necessarily what people want to see either. Because at that point they want to see, I'm going from Munch GitHub, I'm coming to Tide. What does that actually mean for me as an end user? They're not necessarily interested in how does Tide work. And that's a different question that needs to be put, it doesn't necessarily need to live anywhere as well. Yeah. It just needs to be in an email.
Personally speaking, part of why I'm just totally guessing this group's motivations, but I haven't seen us do the best job at keeping docs up to date as we deploy a lot of changes to the way things work. It's partially because we're a little insular about that. It's partially because we're really hopeful that the code is so self-explanatory that if people could just read the code, they'd figure it out, which is nice and all, but that's not really going to fly for a much larger community of developers, especially new first-time contributors. So it's that question of how do you have just enough docs that aren't likely to fall out of date, because the stuff that's in community has fallen out of date because it's drifted behind all of the other stuff and it's big and it's heavyweight. So I like the idea of having the reference stuff, the details hosted directly on the infrastructure and then linking to that infrastructure as often as possible whenever our automation interacts with users on comments and pull requests and stuff. I still think there's that higher level TLDR summary for users to get hooked into that in the first place.
Well, I think we've actually been doing a number of TLDRs in the infrastructure as well. The plugin help is a good example of self-updating, short, end user oriented.
So my other thing on the plugin help, it's freaking awesome, by the way. It's so great to finally have that. I didn't know I needed to put a .html on the end of it, or I would have demoed it live in front of people at KubeCon because somebody asked where they could go to get this. It's not yet, I set up that redirect go.kates.io bot commands. I can't yet point that at plugin help yet because I think some people really like having just the table of commands. I also really like how plugin help has an explanation of what it does and why and example usages. But I'm wondering if there could be two different pages driven off of the same metadata. I also sometimes get questions about which repos is this plugin enabled for? And I have to tell people, well, what repo do you want it enabled for? And then choose that from the drop-down box. So there's if we think it's ready to just be exposed to a larger audience, we absolutely can do that. Because I think right now I've just been organically trying to put it in front of people's face as much as I can.
It might be useful then, for example, with that last thing again, we can make that self-document. We can have it when you expand a plugin that it says, at the end, this is enabled for XYZ repo.
Yeah, that's an easy addition. I can do that pretty easily. That information's already in the plugin help JSON.
Okay, I figured it was, and that's the sort of thing I can file an issue for, and I'm happy to just like say we're working on improving this. Feedback from folks like Matt Farina and new contributors welcome. But sounds like we're ready to.
If you take a look at the most recent Tide update, which needs a few tweaks but is now deployed, I'm really hoping we can get to a point where an end user can come to this page and mostly understand what's going on. I do think we need an introduction. It's like, oh, by the way, we have a merge robot somewhere else. But once you know that we have a merge robot and like this is the dashboard to go to it, I'm hoping that like it's clear enough just looking at the page that, okay, you need everything to be green to pass, and this is it. I'm still like, I'm not happy with it yet, but like if you see like where it's going from where it came from, I think that part's the right direction. I think we're just lacking any docs that are like, oh, by the way, this is we have a merge thing, or we have test runner, and this is how you get to logs.
Okay. Well, so I will attempt to file issues for areas of clarification. Matt Farina, if you're working on stuff in this area, I'm assuming you've got issues you're going to work against or file as well. And if anybody here is interested in tackling that stuff, please do so. Like, it's the sort of thing where I really am interested in this, but every time I get really interested, I also get sidetracked on other stuff. So I don't want to like assign it to myself and then never do it. But if it's still open after a little bit, I will do my best to get to it. Because like I learned a lot by just rewriting the document on owners files, which I've noticed we've changed some of the stuff that implements that, blunderbuss and approve handler now in Prow. If we can get rid of all of that from all the Munge GitHubs, then that page can be shortened quite a bit. Anyway, stuff like that.
There was also one other like kind of related topic that I put on the Contribx meeting, which I think we need to have like a clear avenue for comments for when we're about to change, when we're about to make changes that aren't necessarily just in the background. And this can be stuff that it influences how people actually work with the repos, just to give the larger dev community a place to have comments and feedback before that goes live. I think Matt was bringing a lot of that up recently with some of the changes we made to the stale stuff.
Yeah, my suggestion there was I think like we did a really good job of putting forth a proposal where we thought through it and iterated it. What we didn't do was then open that proposal up to the larger community. It was just floated within SIG test. It may have tangentially found its way to SIG Contribx. I forget if I raised it there or not. And then it never got raised to Kubernetes dev. And like there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen who are belly aching over like things that could be answered, but it's a matter of making sure they have questions about potential use cases and they know that there is an answer for that question. Like, can I find all of the issues that were automatically closed by the bot? Yes, you can. Here's the label query you can do to get it, rather than a lot of back and forth over, oh, should we do this or shouldn't we? But I still think having that discussion up front rather than just springing it on people is the better, safer way to build trust. To that end, one of the other trust building things I'm trying to do with the community repo is I warn people that I'm going to remove direct write access to that repo. I'm going to take away all the teams but community maintainers, community admins, and steering committee. I'm happy to even take away steering committee if I can convince other people in the steering committee that's a good thing to do. The community repo doesn't use milestones, so I don't need the /milestone command implemented before I do that. And I'm not being really creative or thinking outside the box. I don't know what use cases I'm missing in terms of what people would need direct write access to be able to do. Most of the ones I've used on a daily basis as a member of the release team as either the triage role or the CI signal guy are handled by the bots now. So if anybody here knows of any use cases that haven't been implemented by Prow yet, let's file issues on it. But unless anybody here has any objections on removing write access to community, I'm going to do that tomorrow. Cool.
I'd also like to just jump in and say, I like your idea of setting Tide up on the community repo. We've now been using it really successfully on the charts repo, and they've got about similar throughput these days. So
Um, oh yeah, on the Tide thing, real quick, like, is there any ordering at all with Tide?
Yeah. Once it identifies all the PRs that are in essentially eligible for merge, if there's multiple that that it has to choose between, it'll choose the ones with the lowest PR numbers.
Okay, that's good to know.
So choose the oldest PR first if there's multiple that are up for merging.
Okay. Might there be like a separate label query we could use if we needed a high priority thing? The use case that came up this morning, right, was, and it was, I guess, not really a critical or urgent need, but somebody had a PR that was likely to suffer a lot of rebases if many other PRs got ahead of it in the queue. And so they wanted it to go in first. The we don't have priority answer, I think, is just wait, we'll get to it. You'll just have to rebase until we get to it, which isn't an ideal answer.
Or click the merge button.
Yeah, that's kind of been our answer so far, but it's not. It does invalidate the merge queue. So,
did we determine like what? Because we added a size to the tide pools recently. Did we determine why infinitely sizing to the pools was a bad idea? Or like, is there?
You mean for batch merges?
Mm-hmm. Because it's kind of a moot point if we can like, especially if we're running more, like if we were to do like an exponential backoff and do like a couple different batches from the larger thing, if the batch with like 100 PRs merges, then it doesn't really matter what the priority was because it'll be a lot faster. I think 5 is just kind of an artificial number at this point.
Yeah, I think if we had an exponential backoff, that could work. But I think the main idea was that if we did a batch with 100 PRs and we just knocked it down by 1 each time, it would just repeatedly fail.
I guess there's also a question of whether too large batch size makes bisecting painful.
Right. I guess the question was like, yeah, does increasing the number of PRs in a batch that have green tests necessarily decrease the chance of that batch failing?
It should, right?
Should it? We're running the test only once.
There's more chance that they could have conflicting changes, and there's more chance that one of them is a bad PR.
I thought we filtered out the bad PRs by requiring green tests first, and conflicting changes are pretty rare.
Yeah, we do require green first.
Because it almost feels like it should just be like a flat flake rate across. Doesn't matter what the code underneath it.
Things can flake green and then not go green again.
So like this kind of
I think
rationale into why we're tuning the tide pools the way we're tuning them is the sort of thing some folks might be interested in seeing documented discussion on, right? That's part of why that's the level of documentation I feel like we owe folks.
Initially, the reason why we set a limit on the number of things we would batch together was because batch didn't exist and there were concerns about it'd be too hard to determine why my test started failing if we're merging too quickly, essentially. And I think that, so yeah, I think the concern would be if you merge 100 PRs at the same time, then you have to search through 100 PRs to figure out like which one regressed my job. But I think that, I feel like everybody's very comfortable, but really this was kind of just a, the idea of merging 100 PRs at the same time was too scary given where the community was, but I feel like the community is pretty comfortable with batch merges these days, and so I think it would be good to try and just merge as much as possible. And we could theoretically, throw off, like we were saying, we could throw off, the whole every power of 2. So if you have 100 PRs, then try a batch of 1, a batch of 2, a batch of 4, a batch of 8. And see, merge the one that passed the largest number of PRs.
It sure would be useful to have data on who's actually impacted by this and how often it's happening. Like, who's actually bothering to fix failures in post-submit jobs? Just to understand how many people's lives we'd be making more difficult with this. The nightmare scenario that's always brought up as an example to me are the scalability jobs, which take 17 hours to run fully. And so if you're bisecting, that's that's a lot just to jump between, the difference between 4 and 5 commits to jump through is a lot.
How often do those run?
Every day, every other day.
So, I mean,
that's a whole separate, those
Yeah.
things being like blocking is a whole separate discussion.
it's kind of like a different conversation though, because like on that one, you're artificially rate limiting the merge throughput of the repo to reduce the number of merges that happen in a day, to reduce the number of git bisect steps you have to do for a scalability job seems.
Yeah, like I said,
Smart.
the
So
thesis of some of the slides I just showed you is we should ignore jobs that take longer than 2 hours to run. They're
Right.
effectively meaningless unless people are actually making sure they go green, which that's a whole different set of BigQuery things to write. Okay, I'm way over time. I'm sorry. I just burned through the last couple of things. Eric, you have modified FetaBot to automatically flag and close stale issues. Thank you very much for putting that forward. I think if there's a place where we document how this bot functions, that would be useful to point people to. I think right now it's just in that Kubernetes dev thread. But I was able to understand pretty quickly the jobs that are hooked together and stuff. So it should be a pretty quick demonstration of there's this bot that runs, these are the jobs that apply the labels, this is the job that closes things based on those labels, et cetera, et cetera. And it's getting people's attention, which is always good. Steve, thank you for pointing out that somebody has proposed to put together a framework to house put together a repo to house reusable test frameworks. And in the context of the discussion we've had on the mailing list last week around sort of changing or expanding the scope of SIG testing to include the actual tests themselves, I think that SIG testing makes sense as the owner of the test framework. So like test E2E framework and whatever integration test framework there could be to make integration tests more reusable. But it's not something that I personally have the capacity or bandwidth to drive. It's just something where I think it naturally makes sense for this group to own that. So much in the same way that SIG apps is like an umbrella SIG, but there are sub-projects underneath of it for Helm and charts and things like that. I think something similar is what I would like to see happen with this test framework repo. Does that sort of line up with other people's expectations of it? Right. And then finally, we're using Bazel 09, which that's cool. I was using Bazel 8 yesterday. So good to know. Like,
I think that switched over this morning or something.
Okay. Yeah. Since I've actually contributed a bug fix here or there to Prow, like Bazel experience is pretty awesome on a Mac. So thank you to the Bazel people and thank you to Ben for Planter. It's been super helpful. Okay, we're 10 minutes over. Have I left everything out? Or left everything? Left anything? There's one thing I left out. The meeting next week is December 26th. I'm proposing we cancel that because it's the day after Christmas. The meeting after that is January 2nd. I'm not sure how many people are actually going to be around for that or not. That's something I suggest we take up in the Slack channel or on the mailing list for cancellation. Okay, cool. Happy holidays, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Christmas, whatever your happy testing. I don't know. Cool. Happy Tuesday, everybody.